Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Perry. I'm the Superintendent of Schools in Gorham. I want to welcome you to our third video series on understanding public schools here in the community of Gorham. And I want to definitely welcome our special guest here and community champion, Sean Moody, who's here to talk with us today about funding, school funding, right, Sean? Sean, do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, no, Heather, it's a pleasure to be here. We've worked together quite a lot since you've been superintendent.
Yep.
And my name's Sean Moody, and grew up here. I tell people I didn't go far in life. I live like a quarter of a mile from where I grew up, and we're half a mile where Chrissy grew up. And we got married and stayed. But no, we love Gorham. It's an extraordinary community. We're kind of just far enough away from the city, but not too far out. Mm-hmm. So we have a good working class community that's active and helpful, generous. A lot of good attributes here in the town. Mm-hmm. So
Yeah, I think that when you say haven't gone very far, I think maybe you can measure that distance in more than just geography, Sean.
I think it's just, I think Gorham has really been the roots of our success. I really do, and I got in a difficult situation there. We just opened up our shop back in 1977, and it wasn't in the right zone, unbeknownst to me. Mm-hmm. So the town literally, code enforcement officer, shut us down, and outpouring of support from community members, the principal of high school, the police chief, business people like Dwayne Shaw, Hans Hansen all converged, and Bill Rust cast a dissenting vote, to keep us in business. Yeah. So I'll never live long enough to give back to the town.
That is the definition of community, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know what would have happened if that didn't go through.
That's great. Well, we're here today to talk a little bit about a less exciting topic by far, but an important one for our community, right?
Absolutely.
Which is school funding, which is a part of the larger governmental budget for the community of Gorham, and then certainly a part of taxes and what people pay to support the various services that are provided by the town, including the schools. And so right now we're just going to talk about schools because I don't know anything about trash collection. You can talk to Ephraim about that if you'd like, but really this is about school funding and trying to help people really understand some of the essential components of school funding and get a sense of that. And so I know you had some questions that you wanted to ask of me, so let's give it a shot and see what happens.
Well, the first one this is like an eye popper, but what is the Gorham school budget, overall budget, Heather?
Mm-hmm. Oh, the overall, right now in FY24, it's about $49,900,000 and some odd thousand dollars.
Wow.
Yep.
I mean, that's when you think about $50 million, invested in our education every year. It's a pretty extraordinary. How was that? I guess. I mean, that's the top line. But where does that revenue come from? How is that apportioned?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Sean. So what people need to understand is that Gorham is the way that we fund education. There are a couple, actually really three funding streams for the revenues that come in. One is state subsidy. That's a pretty big one, right? The other big one is tax revenue, right? And then the third one is, I would just kind of label it miscellaneous revenue. But it's really mostly about state subsidy and the EPS funding formula for the state, and EPS stands for Essential Programs and Services. Yeah,
if you could describe, EPS, kind of the summary of kind of how that works.
Yeah. It's a funding formula that's based upon basically creating a foundation based upon the number of students that you have in your system. Total. And then there's two sides. There's an allocation side, which is based on student numbers, and then there's a distribution side, which is based on property value. So what it does, if you have to think of it like two sides of an algebraic equation, and they kind of balance at the end of it, right? But the allocation determines that based on this many students, you should have this much money for teachers, you should have this much money for substitute costs, you should have this much money for transportation, and all the different things that are associated with schools. And that builds up to a total number. And then the state says, okay, this total number is how you should, what you should have to basically fund your schools. It's not the total cost of education. Right. It's just what they determine should be the minimal cost of education. And then they look at your property value, each community individually, and they say, based on your value, that's how they determine your ability to pay. So there's a minimum mill rate that they set every year. This year's 6.92 mills. They take that allocation, they multiply it times the minimum mill rate, and that's how much you have to pay at the local level to support public education or to get state subsidy. That's a complex thing, but it really is two sides of a formula. One is all about your students and the numbers of students. So as your numbers increase, your allocation goes up. If your numbers decrease, your allocation goes down. The other side is a distribution. As your property value goes up, your state subsidy goes down. As your property value might go down, your state subsidy goes up.
If you lose a couple students, that could be $6,000-$10,000 a year.
More than that, probably. It'd be about $8,500 is the average per pupil. So
that's
across the state.
$17,000.
There you go.
And if they're in middle school, you're talking $80,000-$90,000 over time. So money is a real factor. And I think the other thing that I look at is in the funding evaluation, most people don't maybe understand. Let's say we want to, support businesses, support commercial and industrial growth.
Yes.
It sounds, and it is a good balance.
It is.
But it's not dollar for dollar like
No.
most people would think. If you could explain that, Heather, if our evaluation goes
up, then you have so again, the state determines an ability to pay by your property value. So as your property goes up, the state is assuming that you have a higher ability to pay at the local level to support public education, and therefore they'll reduce the subsidy based on that. And again, it's all on that last page of the EPS funding formula, which by the way is a 6-page formula.
Wow.
Literally. But on that last page, again, you take that total allocation, which in Gorham's terms is about $39 million, is what they say is our allocation.
What is that percentage-wise, do you know? I know the state, we'll get into that a little bit later about
Right.
the 55%
Yeah,
funding.
it's about 40% or so.
Okay.
For the state, about 45% for the state and about 50% for the local. If you look at the total actual operating
Dollars.
costs of the school. If you're looking at just the EPS allocation, we are actually 60% funded from the state and 40% locally.
I see.
But again, remember, they're defining that allocation.
By that mill rate.
Well, they're defining the allocation by your students, but that's not the total cost of education. The total cost of education is your end budget, right?
Right.
But they're defining, based on the EPS formula, what should it cost minimally to operate your schools.
And they've gone, obviously, they're looking at 150 high schools throughout the state, and looking at all the school districts across the state. So they have these benchmarks.
Yes.
You may agree or didisagree,
Right.
but that they do have a formula that they
A 5-page one.
practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you could, Heather, we're going to jump ahead a little bit, but
That's all right.
the last budget cycle.
Yes.
Obviously a rough go, but now that we're talking and we're opening up some of these dynamics in terms of the ratios and formulas, describe the impact, because the town went through a revaluation.
Yeah.
So how did that kind of complicate, if you will, or add pressure into that budget cycle?
I don't think it really added a lot to the budget cycle itself, by itself, because one of the things that's important to understand too is that property value from the state's perspective is looked at as a 3-year average, so it doesn't all
Okay,
bite
I
at
see.
once. So they look at it as a 3-year
That's good they
average
do
over
that, yeah.
time. Yeah, and that is a good thing, because that kind of helps mitigate the big spikes ups and down
Right.
that might occur with a property reevaluation.
Yeah, say SD
something
Warren,
like
for
that.
example.
Right.
And the
right.
mill
Right.
down scales.
Right, yeah, you can
Yeah.
have it go up and down, like a big a wind farm comes into a community, that spikes the value unless you hide it, with
Right.
TIFs. But that could spike your value in one way, or you could have a mill close and that could spike, downward in your value. So yeah, there's mechanisms in the formula to sort of hold things as steady as
kinda hedge.
possible and kind of hedge those huge ups and downs. And that's one way that they do that in the formula, is a 3-year average of property value. And so we'll see the impacts of that over time, because it's in the rears by 3 years. We're about, I think the first year we began to see some of it would have been this current year, and then 2 more years we'll see the remaining impact of it. But when your value as a community increases
Right.
overall, that's exactly what happens. Your value increases, and therefore
The state
your
subsidy
goes down.
is going to go down.
Yeah.
And that's important for people to recognize that, because who would know that? I mean, unless you're really in the throes or
Unless
on the
you're a
school
geek like
committee
me.
or the
Yeah, yeah,
council,
yeah.
and that's what you do. So I'll get back onto a scripted question
Oh, sure.
that I had, and we talked about so in regards to the budget cycle, looking ahead, we
Yeah.
got another one, not to put a damper on things, right?
It's in-
We got another one coming up.
Well, it's in mid-form
come
right
every
now.
6 months, don't they?
Yeah.
But what are some of the lessons that you learned, Heather, going through that experience, that the school committees learned, and that you're applying towards this next cycle to try to avoid that? Because I think the tension is there, and if as long as it's a healthy tension,
Yeah.
that's the check and balance.
Sure.
But obviously, it wasn't as healthy last cycle. And what are some of the things that you've done to?
Yeah, to sort of to
Improve.
talk about that. Yeah, so first of all, I guess I want to be clear that I actually think that what occurred last year with the 3 multiple votes on the budget actually is kind of a healthy thing, because I think it really does require that a community talk about its priorities and find what are those priorities. And you have to have that dialogue back and forth. And sometimes when a budget goes through just easy and there's no conversation, you don't really have the opportunity for that dialogue, right?
But I think the dialogue should be with the powers that be, not necessarily the voters. But
Well,
anyway.
a school's budget is different, though, because the voters
It's
do have
vote.
the final say,
Yes,
right? And
every
so
year,
I
that's
think
right.
that is different. But I think that what we did learn is that I think we need to do a better job of communicating, number one.
I would agree.
I think that that was a piece that I think was a lesson that was taken away, not only with the general public about what the needs are of the budget and why the numbers are what they are, and there's definitely rationale behind every one of them that's in there, but also I think a better job communicating in-house amongst elected officials and having those conversations to be a little bit more fluid. Yeah.
I guess from a citizen standpoint, looking at that, I can see where the wheels would have wobbled on that wagon.
Yeah. Well, it does take leadership to push through a budget like that
That's right.
every year,
Yeah.
certainly. And I think one of the things that I think it's very, very important that people understand sort of the process that happens. And what happens is the school budget is, you start the conversation in November of
Right.
every year. And then what happens is myself as a superintendent, I'm tasked to put together an initial proposed budget, which I usually give to the school committee somewhere in that February, early March timeframe.
Yep.
But at that point, that's my proposed budget to the school committee. Then the school committee,
Which you have to justify, obviously,
I
right?
have to absolutely,
They're
and
like,
I
"What
have
about
all my
this? What
district
about
leadership
that?"
team justify every piece of it, right?
Yeah.
But once I present to the school committee, then the school committee takes 5 or 6 budget meetings themselves over the course of the next month and a half, and they basically meld that proposed budget into their proposed budget. And that's what they vote on. When they vote in April, that becomes their proposed budget. And then it's their responsibility to sort of shepherd it through to the town council. When the town council approves of the budget, then it becomes the town's budget. So that it's funny how you see that sort of shifting of responsibility and communication that occurs over the course of that time frame, because at the end of the day, then it's the voters that have the last and final say
Right.
in the community. And so when you get to an approved budget in a school system in Maine, with the referendum vote especially, it really truly represents the entire community, because
Yep.
everybody's had an opportunity to sort of impact that. But that process is really important. And I say that because I think what we discovered last year was that we need to do a better job of communicating when it's the school committees, they're digging into that budget and they're really learning about that budget, like right
Yeah,
now.
right.
We need to do a better job of communicating the knowledge that they gain during that time to the town council, as the town council has a more firm understanding of what that budget is when it gets to them.
Right. So again, like you said, I think the community came out of that stronger.
Yes,
From
and
that
I think that-
experience.
yeah.
Wasn't,
It's not pleasant.
No, it's not
by any
pleasant.
stretch, but it's important.
That's right.
For people to engage in that sort of civic dialogue. When
Yeah.
you talk about a community,
That's
as you were
right.
starting off with earlier, and the support that's there for everybody. I mean, people need to trust one another. They need to be able to talk to one another and share their thoughts and ideas about things.
That's right.
And feel as though they're being heard and listened to, and that there's
Yeah.
an exchange that's going on there. And that's very, very important. That if you don't have that dialogue,
Well, it's
you're
like
missing.
people listen right now that may not know. And there's people that have knowledge of things, like from the town side of things that, we wouldn't know, so sharing it. One thing I wanted to ask you, Heather, and I think the listeners, the viewers should know, where do they go? You've had 2 podcasts prior, and I watched portions of those too.
Yeah.
One with President Edmondson
Yep.
from USM, who's a wonderful lady, Kathy Garrard,
Yeah.
a community champion.
Yeah.
Where would they go to see those podcasts?
Yeah, you can go right on our website, and you can see them either on the front page of our website, or you can go a little deeper. I've got them also linked into our budget development place on the website, which reminds me to make sure that folks know that when you go to our website, there's a lot of information on our website. And the way to follow, one great way to follow our budget development process is to go to our website, and there's a school committee tab, and then a budget tab off of that, and you can. We put everything up there, from the 92-page budget booklet that I just gave to the school committee
Yeah.
about 2 weeks ago, to recordings of the workshop meetings that we've had. We've had 2 workshop meetings at this point in time with the school committee. They've got 3 more scheduled,
Right.
and you can watch them all, and you can sort of, not that you have the spare time to do that, because most people don't, right?
Well,
but
when they get wind of something, that's usually when they're right. It's like, whoa, do you know this is going on? Facebook, I mean, let's face it, social media has changed the game, right? I mean, it's different than it was years ago at the coffee shop. You know, you had a little bit of a round table about it. Now it's just, you just see a post, right?
Right,
person, people react to that
Yeah.
post. If I could, on that vein
Yeah.
of prior publications of the podcast, there was one of them was around governance.
Yes.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a question because it's something that I did not know, and I think viewers would be very surprised to recognize how, if you could step through the structure of the school committee.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how it relates to what their responsibilities are and who they're responsible to.
Right, because we did hear that as some comments that came up during the budget difficulties last year. There were lots of questions about responsibility and whose job it is to do what. And I think that was an opportunity to clarify and continue to clarify that the uniqueness of a school committee member is that once they're elected, they no longer serve the people that elected them, which is unusual, right?
That is
Because the town
unusual,
council,
right.
legislature, you get elected, you're serving your constituents that
That's
elected
right.
you. School committee is different, and school boards across the state are all the same, that when they become elected officials, they actually become state officials, and their constituency shifts from those that elected them to the children of that community. So they actually serve the children of that community.
Interesting.
And they do that through the state. It's a state agency
Okay,
under
so
the
would
Department
that
of
be
Education.
Pender Macon?
Yes.
I mean, she's the commissioner of
Yeah.
education.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So that means that the students should have a union
There we go.
to offset the teachers.
They should. Well, they often do, actually. They have a loud voice.
Yeah.
When they speak, people listen.
But that's
that is a-
interesting because I did not know that. And again, when you talk about tension within the community, say why isn't the school looking out for the taxpayers? I'm not saying that obviously isn't part of the process.
It is, absolutely.
But from a governance standpoint,
Yeah.
that's the town council's job, right?
Correct.
I mean, if you
Correct.
would look at the two,
Yeah.
and how that can say this is what we need to provide what we believe will be a world class or the best education that we can. That's the committee's responsibility, school committee's responsibility.
Yes.
And it's up to the town council to say that's within our means or
Right.
that's not within our means.
Correct.
And that's the back and forth.
That's the back and forth, yes. And that happens, every year, since I've been here, there's been that wonderful sort of back and forth that's occurred. And yes, there's been adjustments that have been made, some larger than others, right?
Right.
Depending on what the need is defined by the town council. But that's the dialogue. That's the dialogue that's occurring when that happens, because that is the responsibility of the school committee, is to determine what is that appropriate education funding for the students. They do absolutely try to balance those needs with the taxpayers. I mean, they're not oblivious to the needs of taxpayers when they're creating the budget. They try to contain things and make sure that things are as efficiently operated as possible.
That's right. They're out in the community and they
Right,
hear it. I mean,
right, right.
I
But at the
don't
end of
want to
the
make it
day-
sound like there's just these two
No,
silos.
no,
They're not.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, they have to make a determination. If we have, 530 special education students and they need to have this much for services and this many hours of speech and this many hours of OT and this many hours of whatever else in their IEPs, the staffing that's required for that to take place, they have to determine what that is.
Yeah, and if you could, on staffing, everybody, in the private sector, we've got, I think, actually, our budget's a little higher. Moody's is higher than yours is. But, and again,
Well,
we're
you've
in
got 15 sites, right?
we're in an inflationary period
Yeah.
here with and people, if you're going to hang on to them,
You've
you
gotta
got to
pay
pay
them,
them,
yes.
and they deserve it. They work hard. When I was on the university system and the community college boards, those two boards working together, our faculty and personnel costs were around 65 to 67%, and I think you shared yours is close or around 80.
It's 79.8
Yeah,
right now.
that
Yep.
could be rounded up to 80. So that's significant, and I thought that through. I was like, well, at the higher education level, we didn't have special education. We didn't deal with students with one-on-one, in least instructive environment. Those factors didn't enter into that. So when you take 80% of your budget is people,
Yep.
and that includes compensation, benefits, and the such. That's for whatever you negotiate, right? In terms of contractual increases by the year, whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year deal or beyond.
Yes.
That's you know, when you look at trying to cut, when you say, okay, what are we going to cut? Well, once that deal's done, the contract's done, you're looking at 20% of the.
Yeah, there's really not a lot left. So then you are talking people, which in turn in public education translates to programs, right? Because people run programs, and so when you're looking to reduce people, then you're often impacting programs, and that's, I mean, so like for example, I think 3 years ago, and actually maybe even 4 years ago at this point, we've had multiple conversations about our alternative education program and whether or not that's a priority, because if we're cutting people, do we have to cut programs? What programs do we cut?
Yeah,
you know, that's
where it gets,
there's a question mark for you, right? Because you're dealing with children, right? And the needs of the children, and you're trying to figure out what is that appropriate
I know what the lightning rod programs are, like football, you know, like if you want to rile up the parents, I swear to God, there's got to be a school committee handbook of, okay, we get budget things.
No, let me go to.
It's always been that way.
Let me answer that question though, because I think that did come up last time.
It's been that way for 30 years.
Yeah. Well, also I think the thing to understand is that public education is tasked with providing a minimal education to students to prepare them for success, and when you are forced to make cuts, you're cutting the auxiliary things that aren't part of the core. The core things in public education are reading. They're the same they've always been.
Right.
Reading, writing, math, science, social studies. Those are the core, right? And so when you're forced to say, maybe I can't afford everything that we've been doing, those are the things that get cut. It's not like a playbook that we're going after, like political, capital. It's the reality of the situation. If we have to cut, we're going to try to cut outside of the classroom as much as possible, saving as much as we can for that core programming.
That happens through the budget process.
Sure.
Which it does every year. So if you could talk a little bit about, because we are obviously in a sensitive, period where rising costs, right? Everybody's feeling the pinch, so property tax obviously is part of that, with everything else, fuel, groceries, everything. Coming up on this, after the last cycle, I guess, you took some action in trying to get ahead of, how do we come up with cost controls or find savings, efficiencies. If you could explain a little bit how you reacted from last cycle to say, okay, what could we do?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I think that we're kind of trying to focus on now, and unfortunately it's not an immediate fix. There are a few things that we did that are short term, but one of the things that we're focusing on, number one, is that when we're expending funds, we're trying to expend them in the areas that you get your biggest bang for your dollar. For example, people wonder why that we, in such a difficult budget cycle last year, we added a pre-K program. Well,
that's right, and that's a lagging.
Well, actually, no, it's not lagging. The state now actually pays for that entirely up front. So
but that's a significant. How much roughly was that? 300,000 or 400,000?
Oh no, that was like 1.2 million.
That's
huge. Yeah, so that was part of that increase overall in expenditures, but we had offsetting revenue from the state to offset that. But at the end of the day, too, when you're expending those dollars in pre-K, you know that you're getting the biggest investment. I mean, research proves this out time and time again. You're getting a huge investment. So for every dollar,
don't learn by the third grade, right?
That's right. So every dollar you spend at that age, you're getting like a $2 return on it.
Catching them up.
Yep. So
that's good. That's important.
Yeah, and we specifically created a program in our pre-K where we're focused on making sure that the highest need students are getting the services that they need. CDS, for example. CDS is Child Development Services, has been in the news recently because they're trying to shift it to the responsibility of public schools. Right now, it is not the responsibility of public schools. Right now, there's a separate agency that operates 3- and 4-year-old specialized needs. So it's like special education programming, but it's for 3- and 4-year-olds. But we focused our pre-K program to meet the needs of CDS families because what we were seeing in our area was that CDS was unable to meet those needs. And so we had students coming into our kindergarten classrooms that had never received the services that they were supposed to get as 3- and 4-year-olds. And so what happens? Well, as a public school, we're having to then invest twice as much money to try to get them up to speed in that short period of time. And then they're probably staying in those special education programs longer because they didn't receive the services that they were supposed to receive.
We've worked together on several initiatives, Heather, over the years, since you've came on. Matter of fact, Chrissy was on the hiring committee.
Yes, she was.
Brought you on board. But Aspire is one of the initiatives that was fun. I think you should And don't, I know you're modest, but I think you should showcase this for the folks out there that Gorham, the opportunity that you brought to Gorham High School, or Gorham school system, I should say.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank the partners that funded that, because there was an investment of almost $800,000 made by Mel Mack Foundation in Maine, and in partnership with JMG, which is Jobs for Maine's Graduates. And those two organizations partnered with the Gorham schools to create an initiative that was started 8 years ago now, roughly.
Wow.
Well, in theory, it was started 8 years ago. On the ground, the first person that we started, employing was 7 years ago. That was Eliza.
Right.
Yeah.
Who's still here with us.
Still here
doing
with us,
great
yeah.
work.
And so the program is called Aspire Gorham, and it really is a program that is intended to expose students, then give them opportunities to explore various careers and aspirations of their own, and then experience them. And that's kind of the continuum that we think about. So for the exposure part, we work very closely. We actually have pre-K programming. We have a partnership with Baxter Library that they go out into the child care centers across the community with books and different themes about careers and things, and they go and they talk with children of that age. But then when we get into the public school system, we have a lot of field experiences that we either bring people in, or we send students out to see the jobs in action so that they can kind of get a sense for what those things are. And so you can see all kinds of fun things that the students are learning. And it's not just fun and games. They are just they're little sponges at that age. They're just soaking everything in and asking really great questions about, well, how long did you have to go to school to do what you're doing? Or did you get to play with the animals while you were learning about them? I mean, the questions they ask are incredible. So the exposure focus is at the younger ages, and at the middle ages, it's really about exploring and getting them to roll their sleeves up and get the hands-on stuff. I know that Moody's has been wonderful in supporting us in our Try It days that we do at the middle school.
Right.
Every year, I think you guys have come over, and I think one year I even got to compete with Chris on that tire changing thing.
Putting a wheel on
Yeah,
it.
that was fun. Yeah, but giving them experiences where they can kind of just get their hands dirty a little bit. And so we have Try It Day. We have the Amazing Race that they do at the middle school level. And they also partner with Junior Achievement, and they bring in Junior Achievement for a day, and they
Tell your
spread that out.
story, adopt a classroom. Heather, is there anything that you wanted to conclude with? I know we started on funding. We're back to funding. We're funding the schools, $50 million, and we got to,
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess one of the things I want to leave people with, and when it comes to school funding, is number one, if you want to understand the details of it, it's a complex conversation. You really, I would hope folks, and I would invite folks to reach out to me, and I would be willing to sit with anybody and go through the 6-page, EPS funding formula and talk about how the 175-page school budget operates, like the actual detailed financials and how it's organized and how you can read it and how you can see it. Those kinds of things. I think those are things you can't get across in a 40-minute conversation. No. You've got to spend some time with that, right? But I hope that people understand that there's a lot of processes that go on behind the scenes to get to a proposed budget that really do, I think, bring forward and ensure that at the end of the day, the budget that is approved by voters is the right budget for the community.
Right.
And I really believe wholeheartedly in that.
Oh, I think, there's no, people recognize the value of a good education system. I mean, a lot of people, Pete Mason,
it's an economic development
realtors,
tool.
what's the first thing that people say? Why are you coming to Gorham? Because they got a great school system.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
well, and did you know too?
It's a fact.
But you have 15 sites, but they're not all in Gorham. So we're actually the largest employer in the community of Gorham,
right?
As a schools, above USM.
Before I forget, because this has been great, Heather, and I think it is important for people to recognize, the tension that exists, the healthy tension of checks and balance. This is an interesting thing. I bears explanation. Governor Mills, has got the 55%.
Oh.
That was back in, I think, in 2004, that actually voters, the state of Maine voted in a referendum, said we need to fund public education at 55%. And I think part of it was to elevate education, but also to try to keep property taxes, in check. And so her administration was the first administration to actually do that.
They were the first, yes.
Right, which had a good price tag to it. So most people, I think, that was about the time where the budget cycle hit. Most people would think, okay, well, why is that? So if you could explain why that extra 55% doesn't necessarily an equal amount.
It's not an equal distribution across schools in the state, and it basically how the state defines well, the first question is 55% of what? Now, many people would think, well, 55% of the public schools budgets. Well, that's not how it's defined. It's 55% of EPS costs. So costs that are defined for public education in EPS, which is, as I just explained earlier
started out
on,
with. That's right.
is a lower dollar figure than the actual cost to operate schools.
Right.
Because it's a minimum amount, not the actual cost. So that's the first differential that people need to understand, is that 55% is defined by the EPS funding formula, which in our case is about $10 million less than our actual total budget. And so who makes up the difference of that? That would be the local taxpayers entirely. So that's something important to understand. Yep. The other thing that's important to understand is that the state of Maine, when they say 55%, they say 55% as a whole.
Right.
How that's distributed to individual municipalities depends entirely upon the property value calculation that I talked about. So as your property value increases, you get less and less of that share of 55%. Now, I'm going to say something, though, that people are going to say, no way. But it's true. And
I get a feeling if they watch this tape, there are going to be several times when they say, no way. There's another no way coming. We'll forewarn you this time.
Here's the no way on this one. Gorham is actually the highest subsidy receiver in Cumberland County.
Wow. No way.
Period. Yeah, see, there you go. And the reason is that our property values, even though people think maybe they're high, or they may be thinking that their taxes are high, our property values, when you compare them to our neighbors, is nothing.
Yeah.
It really isn't. We don't have the ocean front. We don't have the big businesses to offset. We don't have those things. And so our property value, when you put it on that scale with the total number of students and the creation of the allocation, and then you define your ability to pay, we actually have a very high percentage. We are, like, when it comes to EPS, like I said earlier, we're 60% funded by the state. That's pretty large.
Right.
Right. But, you know, I guess when people think, I guess the important part to understand, to answer your original question, is that when you think of 55%, it's not an A to B kind of conversation. It's a 55% of this, and then you have to run it through this, and then you have to run it through this, and then you're running it through this, and none of that really dictates what the actual costs are.
There's a lot of formulas. There's a lot of. So Heather, I appreciate you just saying, okay, this is what you think. Those are your opinions, the challenges that we're going to face going forward. Yeah. But we do have a great school system. Our educators, our kids went to school here, man. I mean, and I've talked to a lot of individuals, even some new Mainers that have come to the Gorham system and felt welcomed, and they have had opportunities. Like we've had a couple that have worked actually at Moody's, and that's what makes a community.
It does. It does. It's all together. No one any more important than the other. All working together to try to have, you know, a common goal of that strong community. And Gorham absolutely has that, and we'll do our part as a school system to maintain that, and we'll keep going. But absolutely.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Sean.
Appreciate your time.